morning they discharged me, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain that shows up in movies when something important is about to happen. Just that flat, grey November drizzle that soaks through your jacket before you even realize it's happening. I stood at the automatic doors of St. Node, Matthew's Medical Center in Columbus, with a plastic bag of my belongings in one hand and a folded discharge sheet in the other, and I thought, this is it. 63 years old, fresh out of a double bypass, and I'm standing here alone like I just got off a Greyhound bus. My son hadn't answered the phone in 4 days. I want to be fair about it. I want to tell this the way it actually happened, not the way I've told it to myself at 3 in the morning when everything hurts a little more. So let me start from the beginning. Let me tell you about the envelope first, because nothing makes sense without the envelope. It was the winter of 1989. I was 26 years old, and I had been driving a delivery truck for a regional furniture company out of Dayton for about 8 months. Not because I planned to. I had finished 2 years of a business degree at Ohio State before the money ran out, and I told myself I'd go back. But that's the kind of thing you tell yourself when you're 25 and don't want to admit that the plan has already changed. The route I drove included a stretch through the Hilliard area, and one of my regular stops was a cluster of apartment buildings near the university annex. Graduate student housing, mostly. I'd haul boxes and bookshelves up narrow staircases that smelled like instant noodles and cigarettes, and the residents would tip me $1 or $2 if I was lucky. One afternoon in January, the kind of cold where the air hurts, I was making a delivery on the 3rd floor of one of those buildings when I heard someone in the stairwell below me. Not walking, more like struggling. I went back down and found a young man sitting on the 2nd floor landing with his back against the wall. He had a backpack next to him and a stack of papers in his lap, and he was crying. Not softly. The kind of crying that's already gone past embarrassed. I didn't know what to do. I'm not the kind of person who talks to strangers easily. Never have been. But I couldn't walk past him either. I sat down on the step next to him. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. After about 2 minutes, he wiped his face with his sleeve and said, "Sorry, I'm sorry, you don't need to." "It's all right," I said. "You okay?" His name was Nolan. He was a second-year medical student. He had just come from the financial aid office where he'd been told that his emergency assistance application had been denied, something about a processing error with his documentation, and if he couldn't pay his tuition balance by Friday, he would be academically suspended. Friday was 3 days away. He was $460 short. I want to tell you I'm a generous man by nature, but the honest truth is, I'm not. I grew up in a house where money was tight enough that we noticed every dollar, and that habit never fully left me. I had done the math on my own account that morning. I had a little over $500 saved up in checking, and my truck insurance was due in 2 weeks. I told him to wait. I went out to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time. Then I drove to the ATM around the corner, took out $500, came back up to that stairwell, and handed him the envelope. He stared at it. "I can't take this," he said. "It's not a loan," I said. "I don't want it back." He kept staring. "Why?" I didn't have a good answer. I still don't. Not really. Something about the way he was sitting on that step. Something about the papers in his lap. Something about the fact that I had once sat in an advisor's office at Ohio State and been told that there were no more options for me, and I had nodded and walked out and never gone back. Maybe I just didn't want him to walk out and never go back. Pay your tuition, I said. Become a good doctor. I finished my delivery and left. I never saw him again. I didn't even get his last name. 34 years is a long time. Long enough to live a whole other life, and that's mostly what I did. I spent 6 more years driving trucks, then got into warehousing management, eventually worked my way up to operations supervisor at a mid-size logistics company in Westerville. I married a woman named Claudette in 1994. We had our son, Devon, in 1997. I coached his little league team for 4 years. I drove him to school every morning until he got his license. I was at every graduation. I helped him with the down payment on his first apartment. I did everything I was supposed to do. Claudette died of breast cancer in 2018. That was the beginning of things getting harder. Devin took it hard too in his own way. He had just gotten married, his wife Tara, and I think the grief hit all of us differently, and we didn't handle it as a family the way we should have. He moved to Charlotte with Tara about a year after the funeral. I understood it. People build their lives. I understood it. What I didn't understand, and still don't fully understand, was how it turned into phone calls once a month, then once every few months, then texts on Christmas and my birthday. I told myself he was busy. He had a demanding job in commercial real estate. Tara worked long hours too. I told myself these things, and mostly I believed them, or I tried to. When the cardiologist told me I needed open-heart surgery, a double bypass because 2 of my arteries were significantly blocked, I called Devon the same evening. He said he'd look at flights. I told him it was scheduled for the 2nd week of November, and I'd keep him updated. He said to let him know if I needed anything. I didn't hear from him again until the day before the surgery, a text that said, "Hope it goes well, Dad. Tara and I will be thinking of you." It went well. The surgery went well, and I woke up in a recovery room with a nurse adjusting something on my IV and a window showing a white sky, and I was alive, and I was grateful. I was genuinely grateful. I called Devin. Voicemail. I texted him. A thumbs-up emoji came back 12 minutes later. On the 3rd day, the case manager, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Bev, came to my room to start discharge planning. She asked who would be picking me up and helping me at home for the first week. I told her my son. She said she'd need a contact number. I called again. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. I called again. This time it rang twice and stopped. Not dropped. Stopped. I borrowed Bev's landline and called from that number. He answered on the 2nd ring. The conversation was short. He said Tara's mother had a health situation and they couldn't get away right now. He said I should look into a home health aide or ask a neighbor. He said he was sorry, but it really wasn't a good time. His voice was careful, the way your voice gets when you thought about what you're going to say before you pick up the phone. I said okay. I said I understood. I didn't say what I was thinking because I'm 63 years old and I know the difference between a conversation you can have and a conversation you can't. When I tried to call him again that evening to ask about something specific on the discharge paperwork, my call went straight to a full voicemail box. When I called from my cell the following morning, I got a recording that told me the number I was trying to reach was unavailable. He had blocked my number. He blocked my number 2 days after I came out of open-heart surgery. I sat with that for a while. I sat with it the way you sit with something that doesn't make complete sense yet, hoping it will eventually. Bev came in the morning of discharge and asked about my arrangements. I told her I had contacted a rideshare service. She looked at me with that particular expression healthcare workers develop when they're professionally required not to say certain things. She went over my aftercare instructions very carefully. She made sure I had the follow-up appointment written down twice. She handed me a list of home health agencies and said gently that the first few days were the most critical. I thanked her and told her I'd be fine. I wasn't thinking clearly when I walked through those automatic doors into the rain. I know that now. Post-surgical brain fog is real. The medications were making everything slightly soft around the edges, and I had this plan that didn't fully make sense even as I was executing it. I'd take a rideshare home. I'd call a neighbor named Gordon who owed me a favor. I'd manage. I was looking at my phone trying to remember how to open the app when a voice behind me said, "Excuse me, are you all right?" I turned around. There was a man standing a few feet away, maybe 50, wearing a long charcoal coat. He had the kind of posture that comes from people who've spent decades being professionally confident. He was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as cautious recognition. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just getting a ride home." He took one step closer. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" I told him. It was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you ever drive a delivery truck? Back around 1989? The rain was still coming down. A car pulled up and drove past. I looked at this man in his charcoal coat, and I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with the surgery. "The furniture company out of Dayton," I said. It wasn't a question. His name was Nolan Whitfield. He was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Matthew's Medical Center. He had performed my bypass. We stood in the rain for about 30 seconds without saying anything else. Then he said, "Come inside, please." His office was on the 4th floor. It looked like every other surgical chief's office I've imagined. Diplomas and framed things on the walls, a desk that was mostly organized, a window with a view of the parking structure. He had his assistant bring coffee, and we sat across from each other, and he told me what had happened after that January afternoon in the stairwell. He had paid his tuition. He had not been suspended. He had finished medical school and matched into a cardiothoracic surgery residency, which he said was the hardest thing he had ever done. And there had been many points during that residency when he thought about quitting, and the thing that stopped him was remembering the delivery man sitting down on a step next to him in a cold stairwell and not walking away. I told him I didn't remember it being such a grand gesture. I told him I had almost not stopped. I told him about the truck insurance. He laughed at that. It was a real laugh. Then he asked who was picking me up, and I told him. I don't mean I told him everything. I meant I told him everything. I meant I told him the facts. The discharge, the arrangements, the ride share. He asked a few questions and I answered them honestly because there's something about being on the other side of a very long time that makes you too tired to construct a comfortable version of the truth. He was quiet after I finished. Then he said, "My wife and I have a guest room. I'd like you to stay with us while you recover. And I'm not going to take no for an answer, so you can save us both some time." I told him that was not necessary. He told me he had been trying to find me for 11 years. Apparently, he had hired a private researcher at some point. This sounds more dramatic than he made it sound, because he'd always wanted to return what he called the favor. And the furniture company had long since closed, and the name I'd given him was common enough that it hadn't led anywhere useful. He'd eventually let it go, and then I'd shown up on his surgical table and one of the nurses had mentioned my name while he was reviewing my chart the morning of the operation. And he said he'd stood very still for a moment before he went in to meet me. "I didn't say anything to you beforehand," he said, "because I didn't want to affect your confidence in the procedure." I thought about that. A man who once sat on a cold stairwell crying about $460 had spent the last 11 years quietly trying to find me. And then when he finally did, He had prioritized my surgical outcome over his own need for closure. I didn't say anything for a while. "All right," I finally said. "Thank you." His wife Rosalind was the kind of person who makes you feel at home without making a production of it. She was a high school principal, recently retired, and she had the calm, no-nonsense warmth of someone who has spent 30 years managing situations more complicated than an unexpected house guest. The guest room had a heating vent that actually worked, and a window that looked out at a yard with 2 oak trees that still had most of their leaves. I slept for 14 hours the first night. The recovery was slow, the way all real recovery is slow. Not dramatic, just daily. Rosalind made sure I ate at regular times. Nolan checks my incision every evening before dinner with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of someone who has examined thousands of chests and still takes each one seriously. I followed the cardiac rehab exercises. I took my medications. Week by week, I felt less like I was made of tissue paper. Devon called me in the 3rd week. Not on my cell. He must have tried and remembered what he'd done. He called Nolan's landline, which I can only assume he got through some form of internet searching, or possibly through the hospital. I don't know, and I didn't ask. I didn't know what to say when I heard his voice. I was sitting at Nolan's kitchen table with a cup of decaf and the morning paper, and Rosalind had quietly stepped out of the room, and I held the phone for a second before I answered. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." Those were the first words. Not an explanation, not a context. Just, "I'm sorry," in the voice of a 26-year-old man who was probably scared of the silence that was going to follow it. I said, "I know." I let him talk. He talked for a long time. Some of it I had suspected. Tara had been pushing for distance for years, had made it a condition of certain things, and Devon had gone along with it because he didn't want the conflict at home, and he told himself it would be temporary, and then temporary kept extending. Some of it I hadn't known. Apparently he had been in therapy since the previous spring, and his therapist had been asking him to think about what he was doing and why, and the surgery had been a reckoning that he hadn't handled well, and he knew it. I panicked. He said, "I know that's not an excuse." "It's not?" I said, "but I hear you." We talked for almost an hour. I didn't tell him everything was fine, because it wasn't, not yet. I didn't tell him we were okay because we weren't, not completely. But I did tell him that I was willing to have more conversations like this one. That was the truth, and I've learned to stick to what's true. He drove up from Charlotte 2 weeks later. He came alone. He sat in Nolan's living room and met a man who'd become my closest friend in my 63rd year of life. And there was a moment, I watched it happen, where my son looked at Nolan and understood something about what he had abandoned me into and what I had found instead. His face did something complicated. I didn't say anything. Some lessons you have to let people arrive at themselves. Tara filed for divorce that February. Devon called to tell me, and I didn't say I told you so, because I didn't think it, not exactly. I thought, I hope he finds something solid. I hope he builds a life that doesn't require him to shrink himself to fit into it. I moved back to Westerville in the spring. Nolan and I had lunch together every 2 or 3 weeks. We still do. He is, as I said, my closest friend. That is not a small thing to say at 63. You don't expect to find a friend at 63. You think those connections are things that happen in your 20s and 30s, and then gradually you just maintain what you built, like a garden that's already been planted. But here we are. Devon came for Thanksgiving that year. He and Nolan's youngest son got along unexpectedly well. They're close in age, both spent time in commercial real estate. Both had a lot of opinions about the Detroit Lions that I could not follow but was happy to listen to. Rosalind made a sweet potato casserole that I am still thinking about. We sat at a table that wasn't my table, in a house that wasn't my house, and it felt more like home than my actual home had in a long time. I want to be careful about how I say what I'm about to say, because I don't want it to sound like a tidy lesson. Real life doesn't tie up with a bow. My son and I are still finding our way back to each other, slowly, the way you navigate a path that got overgrown. Carefully, and with attention to where you step. That's not a bad thing. Careful and attentive is not a bad way to rebuild something. And Nolan, I think about that January afternoon sometimes. I think about how I sat in my truck at the ATM and almost drove away. I think about all the versions of that moment where I didn't stop, where I drove back to the warehouse and deposited the $500 in savings like I'd planned, when Norrin Whitfield didn't get to finish medical school and became someone who drives a truck or works in logistics or sells insurance or does any of the 10,000 other things a person can do with a life. I think about what that would have meant for the people whose hearts he's repaired. I think about what it would have meant for me, lying on a surgical table in November of my 63rd year with 2 blocked arteries and no one coming to pick me up. I don't think kindness is always rewarded. I've been around long enough to know that's not how the world works. Most of the time you do something decent and nobody knows, and nothing comes back, and that has to be enough. That has to be the point of it. That it's enough on its own. But sometimes the thing you did 34 years ago is standing in a charcoal coat in a hospital doorway in the rain, and it says, "Come inside, please," and you do. I don't have a tidy way to end this. I'm a 63-year-old man who's learning to walk farther each week, who calls his son on Sundays now, who has lunch with his best friend every few weeks at a diner in Westerville where the coffee is too strong and the pie is excellent. It's enough. It's more than enough. It's the most I've ever had. I've thought a lot about what kind of person I was in that parking lot, ATM, in January of 1989. Not a generous one, not naturally. I sat in that truck for a long time because I was doing math, real math, the kind where you weigh your own security against a stranger's and you tell yourself it's reasonable to choose yourself. Most people would have driven away. I almost did, what I've come to believe, not from any book or teaching, but just from living long enough to see how things unfold, is that character isn't what you do when it's easy. It's what you do in the 30 seconds before you talk yourself out of it. I didn't make a noble choice in that stairwell. I made a scared, slightly irrational choice that cost me 2 weeks of financial breathing room. The nobility, if there is any, came later, when time did what time does and showed me what that moment had actually been. Nolan became a surgeon because someone didn't walk away. That's just true. And I survived a surgery because the surgeon who repaired my heart had spent 34 years becoming the kind of man who stands in the rain outside a hospital and asks a stranger if he's all right. You can call that coincidence. I'm not going to argue with you, but I will say that the two of us, standing in that doorway, felt less like chance and more like the long, slow result of a single decision made on a cold afternoon by a 26-year-old who almost didn't stop. What I wish I had understood earlier, and this is the part I think about most when I think about Devon, is that integrity compounds. Not quickly, not in ways you can track or predict, but steadily, the way interest accumulates in an account you forgot you had. Every time you do the harder, more honest thing, you are making a deposit into something you may not see the return on for years. And every time you take the easier, smaller road, the blocked number, the voicemail, the thumbs-up emoji when your father is waking up from surgery, that compounds too. Devon is learning that now. I don't say it to wound him. I say it because I believe he's genuinely learning it, and I think he'll be better for it, even though the lesson was expensive. The three things I keep coming back to are simple. Do the honest thing even when the math says don't. Build your intelligence not just to succeed, but to understand what's actually in front of you. Nolan's residency was hard, not just physically, but because he had to become someone wise enough to hold other people's lives with steadiness and keep going when it's hard in the ordinary, unglamorous day after day way. Nobody talks about the years in the middle, the decades between the stairwell and the rain. Those years mattered too. I'm 63. I have lunch with my best friend every few weeks at a diner where the coffee is too strong. My son calls on Sundays. The oak trees in Nolan's backyard have probably dropped all their leaves by now. None of this is the life I planned, and all of it is more than I deserve. And I think those two things can be true at the same time.